I want to bring in our political panel. Senior advisor to Donald Trump's campaign, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, joins us, and Democratic strategist Michael Feldman. Michael, let me start with you, because this AP report, again, specifically, it's more than half of private individuals who met with Secretary Clinton during her time as Secretary of State were foundation donors. Now, this doesn't include foreign heads of state or foreign officials or U.S. government officials, but again, more than half her meetings, foundation donors.
Yeah, I think what you'll find when you look at that list in detail is that there's a lot of overlap between people who gave to the foundation and people who were involved in causes and who would otherwise get a meeting with the Secretary of State or could certainly ask for a meeting with the Secretary of State. You have to understand, the Clinton Foundation was set up to basically match donors with causes. So it's not unusual that people, high net worth individuals who are able to give substantial sums of money to help prevent HIV and AIDS transmission in Africa. If you're one of those 11.5 million people, by the way, who had access to treatment because of the Clinton Foundation, you're certainly glad the Clinton Foundation was set up. Or if you're one of those 50,000 preventable deaths, somebody who survived because of the work of the Clinton Foundation, you're certainly glad that money was there. But I don't think it's that unusual that there was overlap between a pool of people who funded the foundation and a pool of people who would otherwise have reason to deal with the Clintons in their official capacities.
And look, you could also make the case that a lot of the private meetings she would be having would be with friends or people she knew who would also donate to the foundation. And,
Sure.
But, though,
Yeah.
Michael, doesn't this get to the issue, again, just of appearances? And there was
Yeah.
so much work and there's so much concern when she came into that job.
Sure.
The Obama administration was concerned about this.
Yeah.
They wanted a strict separation. And when you're dealing with more than half the visitations, when you have Doug Bann emailing Huma Abedin, to set up meetings, again, it's just the appearance that there are these fuzzy lines.
Yeah, two things. First of all, obviously it's an unusual situation, right? A post-presidency and a foundation set up by a post-president doesn't always include a spouse who ultimately ends up becoming Secretary of State and running for president in her own right. So I agree. And there was a lot of overlap between individuals who had interests and worked on it for these various entities. And obviously the Clinton campaign and the Clinton team find that there's an appearance issue here, which is why they took the steps they did yesterday to try to remove this issue a little bit from the campaign table. But let's not forget, we are in the middle of a presidential campaign. So it's not unusual also for people to grab onto issues like this and try to gin them up and raise them in the context of a heated presidential campaign.
So, Sarah Huckabee, let me bring you into this, because Donald Trump calling for transparency when it comes to Hillary Clinton's role. The Clinton Foundation wants a special prosecutor, but he doesn't want transparency when it comes to his own tax returns, right? So, why are the two issues different at this point?
These are hardly comparable issues. Hillary Clinton not only broke the law, she then lied about it and put our national security at risk.
That's it.
To say that that's the same thing as Donald Trump not releasing his tax returns is laughable and ridiculous, frankly. I mean, those aren't even remotely similar things.
What evidence do you have that a law was broken in terms of the Clinton Foundation? Donald Trump called for a special prosecutor. What evidence of it that there was a law broken?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there's pay-to-play activity here. I mean, Hillary Clinton has basically put our government up for sale to the highest bidder. If that's not breaking the law, then I don't know what is. Hillary Clinton gets to play by a different set of rules than anybody else in America. At my house, if you break the rules, then you get in trouble. There are consequences. When my kids break the rules, they get in trouble. When Hillary Clinton breaks the rules, she asks for a promotion. That's entirely different and certainly something that should disqualify her from becoming president, and certainly gives us cause to ask for a special prosecutor in this case.
It's Sarah, and I keep hearing the words pay to play, and I keep hearing broke the rules. But again, what evidence do you have that there was a quid pro quo, that someone was given something from the State Department, by the State Department, because of the donation given to the Clinton Foundation?
Well, I think that's part of the reason that you would ask for a special prosecutor, so they can actually dig in. But I think that right now there's so much smoke. In fact, there's not just smoke, there's fire here, where you've got emails between Huma Abedin, one of Clinton's top aides and donors, asking for special favors. The likelihood that 50% of the meetings that Hillary Clinton took place were also from major donors to the Clinton Foundation. I mean, that's just too much coincidence that would happen. And so I think there's certainly not only reason and cause, but the American people deserve to have somebody that can be objective and look into this and investigate it properly.
So, Michael, the Republican Party thinks they're on to something with this issue. Donald Trump keeps on hitting on it. Reince Priebus excited about it. Reince Priebus did a conference call, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, earlier today, where he said it's going to be important for us and Donald Trump to continue down this measured path that he's on. And if he does that, I think he's going to be tied or ahead at or just after Labor Day. You think Donald Trump might be ahead or tied by Labor Day?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to look at the polls after Labor Day. I will say this. Today might have been the first day that Donald Trump hasn't gotten in his own way on an issue relative. So I understand why Sarah and others have been marching out with their talking points today on this issue, and I understand why they're digging in. But on the whole, I think Mr. Trump has probably gotten in his own way and kept these issues from being litigated. That's as a pure political matter. I think that's been his problem.
But a pure political matter, people have been saying Republicans, they want him to focus on Hillary Clinton, not these other things. And you think at least today he's done that?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's competing with himself. He's also apparently undergoing a rapid transformation on his immigration policy, one that is likely to end up closer to where President Obama is than where he started out in the campaign. And that, of course, is probably generating a discussion within the Republican Party right now. So I think there's equal measure in terms of conversation about that. But I understand the political tactic involved here.
Sarah, last question. Does Donald Trump still want the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country? Does he still want them out?
What Donald Trump wants is a secure border. He's been very clear and very consistent in his position on immigration, and that's first and foremost, we have to secure the border. He hasn't backed down from that, and that's the top priority, and that'll continue to be the top priority when he becomes president.
Still want to know about those 11 million people. Sarah Huckabee, thank you so much. Michael Feldman, great to have you here with us.